If you're a writer, then odds are you struggled with writer's block, that innervating, soul-crushing vein of our craft. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg. I am the author of Tears from Iron, the first in a series called Memories of the Cataclysm, available on Amazon, now on audiobook. So in this video, we'll look at three kinds of writer's block, what I call the slog, the tenuous path, and the hidden blessing. I've got them timestamped below so you can jump around if you like, or just listen all the way through. I've also included links to my book and my Substack. And of course, if you're interested in more conversations like this, please subscribe. Before we begin, I think we need to acknowledge that writing is an art. It's a craft, and we bring our souls to this process. We have different objectives, either in the overarching what we would like to do with writing, or with how we approach story, the settings, the themes, the characters, all those different kinds of things that are important to us and may not be quite as important to others depending upon what their tastes and predilections are. So that causes some degree of variance, but I think writer's block is pretty common to the state of writers, and so I think we also have a lot in common. I may not have covered all kinds of writer's blocks. If you've experienced a different kind and have come up with different solutions, please feel free to share them. I think we can all learn from each other. But hopefully this conversation is helpful to you and also encouraging. The biggest advice as we get started is simply to know thyself. Writer's block is something that's happening inside of your brain for reasons, and if you can understand what those reasons are by examining yourself, that will lead you down the right path. These different writer's block types that I'm going to talk about all have different solutions and different causes, and so if you've identified the wrong cause and take the wrong solution, you may be causing yourself more work, more heartache, more struggle, rather than solving the issue. So let's get into them. The first of these is the slog, and this is what we think about generally when we think about writer's block. The scene doesn't excite you. The magic is gone. It's just grueling. Looking at the page, thinking about the story just makes you want to go do something else. That's the slog. There are two possible solutions when you get stuck in this kind of doldrum. The first is simply to bypass it. This generally works if it's a less significant aspect of the story. It's still important because that's why it's in there, but it's not critical to the development of a character or of a theme or of the overall plot, so you don't have to flesh out every last detail. If that's the case, maybe just leave some notes so you don't forget what you're trying to do in it, and then leave it behind. Come back to it later when you're fresh, maybe when inspiration has returned to you, or when it's the last thing you got to work on, and then maybe you have that motivation. I've just got to get through it. So consider bypassing it if it fits that kind of criteria. The other option, unfortunately, is just to grind through it. Force yourself, put that nose to the grindstone and write, even though it's not something you really want to do. And this is particularly critical if you need to understand from this scene, character, plot, theme, things of that sort. And maybe what you grind through is garbage. I mean, I've been there. I've been stuck and knowing that I need to move forward and I can't bypass just written a scene that I'm not proud of. And that's okay, because not everything's going to be perfect. For one thing, you can go back later on and revise it. And another, even if when you do revise it, it's still not that golden moment that you want it to be. That's okay too. Think back to your favorite movie or book or TV show, and I bet you there are moments in those that aren't pure gold. There are those scenes that are okay. They're not the best, but they're surrounded by parts that you like, and so it's okay. You get through them. It's a few pages, a few minutes, what have you, and doesn't really detract from the greater overall story. And that's what we're talking about here. If it's a scene that's not pure gold, that's okay. Just don't do it too often. And also, if it's one of those really critical scenes to your story, then maybe what you're suffering from isn't the slog at all, but one of the other two kinds of writer's block we'll talk about here in a moment. The key here is, as I've already said, to know thyself. Understand why you're stuck. Understand the importance of the scene and how much effort needs to go into it. Is it one of those critical scenes or is it one of those minor scenes? And make your decision on how to handle it based upon that diagnosis. All right, so let's look at number two. This one I call the tenuous path. It's more common, I think, among discovery writers. I like the term discovery writer because it's more complimentary. Some people call them pantsers for writing seat of the pants. I'm a bit of a hybrid between the discovery writer and the more organized writer. I have a general, very broad outline with benchmarks that I follow, but most of what I write is actually discovery writing where I flesh out and understand more and more of the story as I go along. So I sometimes suffer from this one. And if you're a discovery writer, then perhaps you do as well. And what I'm talking about with the tenuous path is you started out, you've got a good momentum going, everything's going fine, you're laying those benchmarks along your story, and you have this objective in sight at the far end of your novel. But as you're writing, then things begin to gradually get more tenuous. You feel a little more shaky, like you're not quite sure where you're going. I sort of liken it to building a bridge across a chasm where you're laying board by board with each word, each scene, each paragraph, so on and so forth. And the further you get out, the more shaky and wobbly it gets. And then at some point, it wobbles so much that you fall off into the chasm. And that's the tenuous path, where you have fallen off the path and you're stuck. So what do you do about it? First, acknowledge that it's not all bad. You've had some successes. You have got your story going. You have begun fleshing out those major character, plot, and theme concepts, and you've made some good progress. The problem, most likely, is that along the way, you've created some inconsistencies. Perhaps an idea you had for your protagonist at the beginning has morphed a little bit along the way until now their character is enough different that something isn't jiving quite correctly. Or that could happen with a plot. Maybe you veered off from your overall objective with your plot, or your theme has somehow become twisted. Something you've done because you didn't have it fully fleshed out at the beginning has veered into territory that isn't the direction that you wanted to go. Unlike the slog, pushing through this kind of a writer's block won't work. You've created inconsistencies, and pressing on into those inconsistencies will just make it worse. That's why you fell off the bridge in my analogy. So instead, step back, take some time. Maybe you've written so fast that your brain can't keep up with all that you've covered, and you need to process what you've done. Take a look at all the work and then diagnose why and where that tenuous change happened, and decide, do you like where you went and maybe you need to change the beginning, or do you like where you started and you need to tighten up where you've gone to make it more in alignment with how you set out? This leads to two possible outcomes. Bottom line is you need to back up to where things went awry, or jump if you decide that you like the new version. Jump to the beginning and fix all that came before the new thread concept was established, and you need to fix it at that point. I should say, and you need to fix it up to that point. So for an example, in Tears from Iron, I have a secondary plot between the High Lords of the Siristari, and they are conspiring against the Empress. It parallels the main story of our protagonist, Vistus. But as I was writing this High Lord conspiracy, I realized that I was taking it into paths that I didn't really want to go. It wasn't working quite right. And I realized I need to rework that whole section. Fortunately, it was a secondary plot and one that only has occasional touch points with the main story. And so I was able pretty easily to extract those conspiracy sections and just rewrite those and then input them back into the story, and everything worked out fine. That works if it's a secondary plot or smaller idea, but unfortunately sometimes if it's your core story, then the problem may actually be bigger. Don't despair. If your goal is to have quality work, then it's probably worth the effort, and that's something you're going to have to assess. Also remember that if you do back up and start again, or start a certain segment again, you now have a blueprint. Rather than building those steps of a bridge out over a chasm very tenuously, you now have the blueprint of building that bridge. And so your way forward is going to be much more steady, much more certain, and you'll be able to write with much more confidence. But remember, as I've always said, and will say again throughout this video, know thyself. This is the key. Is it really a problem that your writing has become so tenuous that you can't continue the path forward? Or is this just a delay tactic? Is it because you're actually in a slog and writing is just hard, you've lost the magic? And really the answer is you got to press on and go forward till you find that magic again. I think the way to try to assess whether it's one or the other is to ask yourself, is there a way forward past this scene? Looking beyond the next scene, If I can get there, do I know what I want? And if you can say yes, and you can see how you can possibly get there, then odds are it's a slog. If you can say no, the path is just becoming way too wobbly. I need to shore up what I've done. Then you have the tenuous path. Okay, so let's look at the third one. This one I call the hidden blessing because writer's block can be good news. Am I mad? Maybe. We'll see. So this one is similar to the tenuous path, but it is far less limited to discovery writers. It can happen to anyone. So what do I mean? First, a little background theory. The best stories are living things, and they're allowed as living things to breathe. We work with them, we wrestle with them, we sculpt them, but we also give them a measure of control over themselves. Now, as an author, of course, we control everything. We can force everything to happen exactly as we prescribe. We can make any character do anything we want at any point in time, regardless of whether it fits in their character. We can make events transpire exactly at the moments we want them to, even if in a more natural world, they may shift a little bit this way or that, or change entirely. That is our control as an author. But if we exert that level of control, we're stealing the soul out of our story. Now, as an author, of course, there is a responsibility to exert some level of control. Otherwise, the story is going to spin out of control. Characters can be just going behaving willy-nilly. We lose track of our plot. Our themes go in the dumpster, and it just ends up being a mess. So there's a balance. But I found that if you come across those potential magical moments that are surprises and explore them a little bit, then you may find that you've added some great value or even solutions to some of the challenges of your story. Of course, you may find after writing a scene or even a chapter that you've created a heaping pile of garbage. And okay, it's an experiment that failed, and you can just toss that. But I've often found that exploring these extra paths leads to some of the best parts of my stories. And so I would encourage you to consider following some of these paths with a measure of control and a vision always on where you're trying to go. So far, this sounds a lot like the makings of the tenuous path, right? But it has one critical difference, and this happens at the highest level of story. Sometimes you're just telling the wrong story, and the story knows it before you do. Maybe it's a niggling in the back of your mind as you're going forward, and it's like, not all is right with what I'm doing. There's something missing. The magic is here not just because writing's hard, not just because I'm fighting writer's block, but because something is wrong with the story itself. And these are things that you should listen to. Once again, with caveats. As I said before, know thyself. This is where it gets fundamentally important. This is the most important one of all because we're talking about your entire story. Recognize, is it just doubt? Especially if you're a first-time author trying to get your first book done, you haven't completed a story and you're beginning to have doubts about the story you're writing. That's when doubts can strike you the hardest. And if you begin to question your entire story, then maybe you'll just end up rewriting and restarting and restarting and restarting and restarting and never get a project done. So in that case, recognize that. Recognize that it's your own doubt, your own fear of completion, perhaps, your own fear maybe of success or of what happens once I'm done with a book. Now I've got to go out into that world of trying to get this book published, which is a whole nother monster with a whole nother level of stresses all its own. So knowing when you're listening to the story or when you're just listening to the doubts in your own mind is critical. Let me use an example of how this was a success for me. And this is actually in the current project I'm working on. It is a much longer tale than Tears from Iron. In fact, I have decided rather than developing it as books, I'm going to release it in 8 acts, where Tears from Iron, for example, has 3 acts. Most books do. This one is going to be in an act serial method. And as I was working through my tale, I had a general idea of what I wanted to get done. I had a concept of my characters and the overall plot arc, a good vision of beginning to end of how that was going to work out. But I was struggling with the main character and his internal challenges as he grapples with the realities of the world he lives in. And unsure of how to handle that, I decided What I really needed to do was just start the story and figure it out along the way. And so I did, and it went really well. I completed the first act. It was something I'm very pleased with. And everything went smoothly. I was developing his character. I was developing his path. The overall plot was working very well. I moved into the second act, and everything seemed to be going pretty well. And that's when it began to get shaky, and I began to get these doubts in my mind. Something is wrong. I'm not sure what it is. And I began thinking about it and looking at where the story was telling me it had problems. I continued pressing on, though, as I was thinking about this. And eventually, to use a horse analogy, it threw me off and I crashed to the ground. And it was wonderful. And that's the amazing thing in this kind of a moment of when you realize that what you've been doing is wrong, but not in a bad way, because in solving that wrong, you realize what you need to do to fix it. At this point, I had written far enough along that I understood my character better, I understood my story better, and I knew the solutions to change it. What it also meant, of course, was I had to go back and start over. This is where you might say I'm mad, I'm crazy. I'd actually written about 60,000 words at this point when I started over. A lot of it, as I said, under the tenuous path section, went smoothly and much more easily because I had built parts of the blueprint and had them solidly figured out. But the difference here was my main character's personality and his interaction with that plot was different, and so it caused nuances and ripples and waves as that played out into what I'd already written, moving forward to where I was thrown off the horse. And that solved all of those problems. It solved the writer's block. It solved the struggles I had with the story. And from that point, I've been moving on successfully. At this point, I have completed 7 acts, 3 of them very highly polished, the other 4 a little bit rough, and I'm working on the final act. Hopefully, it'll be released next year. Look for it. Brothers from Flame and Void is the title. But let's set aside that little bit of an advertisement and go back to the concept of this kind of writer's block as a blessing. And I think what you need to recognize here, as I said before with the know thyself, is when is it you just trying to avoid facing the harder aspects of writing that you need to either slog through or shore up in a tenuous path kind of a circumstance? And when is it you've discovered that there is some core flaw in your story that is making it lose its soul, lose its value even to you as a product, as a work of art that you need to go back and fix. And in that process of going back and fixing it, you're going to make it something that you're really, really proud of. And then you can look back and you can say, I did that. And that is when writer's block can be a blessing. So to wrap this up, the first thing to remember is you're not alone. We all suffer from writer's block. 2, know thyself. Knowing your interaction with your story, with yourself, with the way your mind works, how you handle that craft process is fundamental to knowing how to solve your writer's block issues. And we talked about 3 of them, remember? The first was the slog, which is probably the most common, and just that grueling part where you have to either grind through it or bypass it and come back to it later. The second is the tenuous path, where as you're discovering your story, it gets more and more shaky, and you need to go back and shore up what you've done before. And the third is the hidden blessing, where unfortunately you find that there is a part of your story that's broken, and you need to go back, perhaps probably to the beginning, and fix those aspects that were flawed in order to make sure that the story is something that you really want to tell. And if you follow those, hopefully that will help you as you work your way through writer's block into a final piece that you're happy with. If you have any thoughts on your own struggles with writer's block or your own solutions, your own varieties of blocks, feel free to put them in the comments. I'd love to hear them, and have a good day.